Hi, everyone. My name's Deborah Isaac. I am the organizer of LA Hug, the Los Angeles Houdini user group. Super excited to introduce Daniel Lee. He will be presenting his hug on From Concept to Realization. Thanks for joining us, Daniel.
Hello, I'm Daniel. Thanks for the introduction. For my Hug Talk from Project to Realization, I'll be going over a project that I did in conjunction with SideFX. This was done during my internship at SideFX. And there I chose a concept and I created a VFX shot from it. And I'll be going over my entire workflow from breaking down the concept, modeling, simulation, rendering, all done in Houdini. So thanks for watching and I hope you enjoy.
First, let me show you guys the final shot that I came up with. And while this shot is playing, I would just like to say that this was not an individual effort. I had help from some friends and definitely input from a lot of the folks at SideFX, as well as some professors at school to help me put this together. So I myself am not a character artist or a character animator, so I had some friends helping with that. But as far as the modeling, the effects, the lighting, rendering, and the final composite, that was done by me. Okay. So back to the presentation. So I'll be splitting the presentation into 3 different sections: the geometry, how I simulated it, and final look dev and rendering of the scene. So first of all, I want to talk about, well, the geometry and breaking down the concept. How do you take something that looks so painted and drawn over to something 3D and realistic? Well, I broke this down into 4 different components. The first one is the guy itself, the creature. And as I said before, that's handled by some of my friends at school. And besides that, there are 3 different sections to this piece that I saw. One was the fleshy bits that are attached to different parts of his body, the wall that he's coming out of. And I did some Googling. This sort of holy, oceany sandstone look is called a Tafoni wall. So I gathered some reference for that. And of course, the webs and all the dust and debris that is attached onto that wall. And want to go over the character. This is the first thing that we wanted to finalize before moving on with the project. And the character rig and the sculpt and the texturing is done by Tristan Del Giudice, and the animation is done by Gabe Kevin Mallon. And if you look on the right side here, that is the template geometry that we worked with, so we can get the animation to look right and the creature motion to fit with the wall. And moving on to how I first started tackling creating this Tafoni structure here. So I just want to quickly play a video. This is how I approached this shot at first, creating that sort of holy pattern. So you'll see this setup repeated many times throughout this presentation. So I first start out with a grid. I have an ocean evaluate to that got me a sort of wavy holy pattern that sort of resembles that rock. I scattered some points based on the cusps of the waves, and then some more points. And what I do here is I use the connect adjacent pieces node to connect the the points together. So the points that are close to each other will get a polyline created in between them. And I would resample them to a much higher resolution. And this is so that I can use a fuse in order to combine points that are close to each other together. And depending on the snap distance, you can get the sort of fidelity of the holes that you want. And this is where I guess the magic happens. You smooth this to get the final look. But first I create a point group that resembles the inside points and constraining the outside points. And after sliding the smoothing slider, you can see that the strings sort of tighten up and you get this sort of webby pattern. So this is the basis that I started off with when I was creating this geometry. So that was what I started off with. And the first attempt that I did was to use that as a collision geometry and draping a really high resolution cloth over it. And it did not work. This didn't make it to my final shot. And I ended up with a lot of artifacts on the edges and the cusps there, a lot of stretched polygons that crossed over each other. And it was really slow because you really need a high resolution mesh in order to achieve any sort of detail. And plus, it was pretty much impossible to get sort of I want to call it like negative space, like the cavities within those cavities. So if you look at the reference, you'll see the cavities are sort of caved inwards on itself. So I ended up scrapping this, but this is the final geometry that I ended up going with. It went from just the those strings that you saw before. I turned it into volumes and finally turning it into polygons. And I'll show you how I did that. So I start off with the wall that we animated on to make sure I get the size right. And I subdivided it and laid it flat so I can work on it a little bit more easily. Using the Ocean Evaluate, I did the exact same thing. And honestly, this part didn't end up mattering because no matter how you scatter the points, once you connect them and fuse them and smooth them, they all pretty much look the same. But I did an extra thing here where I did a second scatter and painted on the areas that I wanted the holes to be a little bit smaller. So I scattered more points on those areas specifically. And here I just combine all the points. And this is the same setup that we went through before. So we connect them, we resample them. We do the same thing where we fuse them and smooth them. But there was an additional thing that I wanted to do, and you'll see in just a bit. I wanted to get a more interesting pattern from the side because you can see that this is practically flat. So I wanted to get a wavy pattern back into the geometry. So I did a very quick vellum sim for that. So here I created a group that just groups the points that intersect the most with the webs. And I selected those points and I did a very simple animation on it. So these points just move upwards. And I used this as the target animation for my vellum sim. So once I pin these points to the strings and setting them to match the animation, the final simulation looks like this. So this is all this is doing is a quick sim to get the wavy pattern that I was looking for. And this is the final geometry that I was working with. And this next part was just to get it to match the shape of the concept just a little bit more. So I used a wrangle to push the points in the middle down to create a sort of groove. And then on each side of it, I bumped those points upwards because on the concept, there's sort of a slit down the middle and then grooves on and then bumps on the outside. So that's exactly what I did, just using a wrangle. And after that, just a little bit of mountain to make the geometry a little bit more interesting. Yeah. And the next challenge is, this is sort of just a blueprint for how the wall will finally look like. So I had to figure out, how do you make this into renderable polygons that will look like a wall? And the method I did before didn't work. So I ended up using a more brute force approach, as you'll see. And again, we always study the concept before we go into this. And here I use a copy and transform node to create the depth that I want the holes to be. So if you look down from the top, you'll see that the cells, you sort of see like cells or rooms that is created by this copy and transform. And I created a p-scale attribute that increases as the copy number increases. So as the layers go deeper and deeper, the p-scale will ramp up exponentially, controlled by this curve here. And I worked on each of these layers separately using a for each loop. So inside of that for each loop, I use a convert line to clean up the geometry a little bit, delete the p-scale, resample it, and then this is just to make sure that when we sweep the node, there won't be any intersecting polygons on the cross section. So here we polyframed it and we swept it while using a sweep node. And I used the second input cross sections and piped a circle node into that. And this is where the P scale comes in. So the P scale controls how wide this circle is. So as the layers go down, the cross sections should get wider and wider. And again, just a bit of a mountain to make the geometry a bit more interesting. So since this takes a while to cook, I cached out these geometries beforehand. So if we look at layer 1, you'll see that the cross section is really round and it basically looks like you just swept it, which is basically what it is. And halfway down to layer 8, we have 15 layers in total. You can see that the circle is elongated and some of the smaller holes are covered, but you can still generally get the idea of the original shape. But once we get all the way down to the last layer, which is layer 15, it's just a complete mess and you have no idea what's going on. But trust me, this is intended. So if you look at all the layers together, it makes a lot more sense. So you have each of these cells forming a sort of a bowl, and it's all controlled by that copy and transformed to get the exact depth that I want these holes to be in. So obviously geometry like this is impossible to work with. So I decided to turn this into a VDB surface to work with. So once I run it through that algorithm, this is what I end up with. And the first thing I did was to eliminate some of the noise since the polygons are really messy. So VDB smooth to make sure that I have a workable geometry. And the next thing I do is I want to clean up the edges of this VDB surface, especially the underside of it. So I use the same strings that we worked with before. And I just basically created a shell using a extrude volume to catch the entire bottom side of this volume. So there it is, and using a VDB combine and setting it to union with the previous volume, it cleans up both the edges, but most importantly, the bottom of that volume. So if I take a look at the bottom, a lot of that is cleaned up because before this method, there's a lot of surface underneath that I wouldn't want to be working with. And next up is an important part where I used a VDB reshape to erode the surface a little bit. That's just so I can get those nice clean cusps that I saw in those references. So once we eroded it, you can get those nice sharp corners on the peaks there. And once I smoothed it, that got rid of the really, really sharp peaks that I didn't want. And this next part was to tackle the top section of the wall. So if you look at the reference again, the top section of the wall is smooth and it sort of blends into the rest of the geometry here. So, well, the easiest way to do that is to, well, smooth it. But first, I create some geometry using the template wall that I started with, using a bound to isolate the top section. And here I booleaned this box using a tube to get that shape, and then turning that into a SDF, and then setting it to union back into the wall geometry. I can get it ready to smooth so that it'll be ready to smooth to a flat surface. But first I created a smoothing mask because we only want to smooth the top half of this wall. So I blew up the volume a bit, turned it into fog, and renamed it as a mask VDB so we can smooth it. And yeah, so we changed the name into mask, and using the VDB smooth SDF, we use the alpha mask parameter to isolate that area. So that's what I ended up with after the smoothing operation. And I used the new node in Houdini 19 volume noise SDF just to add a little bit more detail to the surface. There it is. And this last part is to finally cut off the edges of this wall. And again, we use the bound to get the size of the wall that we want, turn it into polygons, turn it into a VDB from polygons and using a VDB combine, setting it to SDF intersection this time in order to slice off the sides of the wall. So we're getting close to getting the final shape of the wall that we want. Now that it's just a little bit more cleanup to do on the polygon level. So we turn this back into polygons and we create a group to isolate the underside of the wall. As you'll see, there's a lot of polygons underneath the wall that we don't need, that we won't ever see in the renders. So we blasted those away, deleted small parts, and this is 90% there. We're very, very close to the end. And this last section is just to add the hole that the creature is going to finally crawl out of. And this part is really simple. All I did was first I stood the wall up because that's how we animated the creature coming out. And I created a geometry that I used to cut a hole in the wall. And this geometry, I decided to make it a tier-shaped geometry because if you have an upside-down tier, the point of the tier sort of merges in with the crevice that I created earlier. So you'll see in just a second, we delete the points in that geometry. And depending on the proximity from that geometry and the rest of the wall, we sunk those points downwards. And you'll see that the whole geometry sort of blends in with the rest of the wall. So that's the final wall that we have here. So the next part of the geometry I want to talk about is, I call it the deep web layers. These are the layers of webs that sit inside of the hole. So in general, I split my web geometry into 3 different portions. The webs that live on the surface of the wall, and then these are the deep webs. So I have 2 layers inside of the hole itself. So let's talk about that. So this is pretty simple. This is largely using the same setup that we had before. Again, we start off with the surface of the hole, and then depending on how deep the point is within that hole, we make an attribute so we can isolate it. So in this case, we use the depth, or in this case, the density attribute to isolate the deepest part of the hole. And here, we set up 2 different scatters. The first one is using a scattering within the volume. So we create this volume using an ISO offset, and we scatter in that volume. And then the second part of this is scattering on the geometry itself. This is so that when we use the connect adjacent points and connect these points together, some of the web intersections will live inside, like in the hole itself, which is what I wanted. So merging those together, we've seen this before. We smooth it, and this is just one of these layers of webs. And coming into the second layer, this is more of the same thing. Isolate this time the front section of the wall using an ISO offset, scattering in the volume, scattering on the surface itself, merging, same thing all the way down. And here are 2 layers of webs. And more interestingly is the webs on the surface, because the webs inside of the hole, the deep webs, I could really just scatter random points and then it'll look pretty good. But the surface webs sort of need an organized chaos to it, because if you think about it, when a spider spins up his webs, it's not random. It sort of has a look to it. And I wanted to achieve that somehow. So this is how I made the surface webs. So first, of course, I start off with the wall that I made before. And here I laid it flat and I deleted the bottom section of the wall that I didn't need. So I'm just working with the geometry that I needed. And here, like before, we isolated the portion of the wall that is the volume that represents the hole itself. So here is the fog volume that represents the hole itself. And I also have the polygons that represent the surface of the hole. But here, when we create the web geometry, I decided to run this through a for each loop, and you'll see why in a second. And here I split up my scatter into 4 different sections instead of just 2. That's because we need webs to live on the surface of the wall. So here I created a mask to mask out a general area where I want the points to scatter. And the second part, I isolated closer to the center of the hole itself. So now I have more points towards the center. And here, we just merge them together, and we also scatter in that fog volume that we created earlier, and also that surface that represents the surface of the hole. So there it is. We merge all 4 of these scatters together, and then we can do connect adjacent pieces with that, and we get something like this. But before we connect the adjacent pieces, there is an important step where I move the points a little bit closer to each other along the edges. So if you look at the reference, I like this look where there are sort of lines pointing towards the center of the hole, and I wanted to get that same look. So I created some lines, and depending on how far away the point is from the center, that determines how closely they're going to stick to those lines. So once I got a slider ready for that, the connect adjacent pieces will connect those points that are closer together to each other. So here we fuse it and we smooth it. And that's the end of the for each loop, which generates just one of those layers. And the reason why I use the for each loop instead of just randomly scattering, that's because with a for each loop, we can change the scatter or move the points just a little bit on each iteration, so that each layer of webs will look just slightly different from the last. So if I get enough layers in, cross our fingers, it should look good. All right. That doesn't look that good, but if you lower the wire width on the viewport, it actually looks pretty good. So here, when we zoom in, you can kind of see a pattern that's created because each of the scatters is just slightly altered, and you get sort of a chaos amongst all these, an organized chaos amongst all these webs. But again, I isolate one of the layers of webs just to work on it. And this is the part where I run it through a vellum sim, because when we connected the adjacent points, a lot of these webs are intersecting the wall geometry, and that causes some issues when I want to go ahead and sim it. So here, after turning them into strings, I use the wall itself as a collider and lay the webs on top of the wall. But rather than laying the webs on the wall, which is too complicated, I lay the walls on the web. You'll see in a second. So here is the collision geometry, which is the wall itself. And I animated it so it just moves up and collides with the webs. That's the easiest way I found of doing that. So there should be a flip book of the wall coming up and colliding with the webs. Yeah, so now I do this with all the different layers, and now all these layers of surface webs sit nicely on top of our geometry. And you'll see that when I display the collision geometry and zoom in here, that the surface webs are nicely laid on top, covering the hole as we were expecting. Okay. And just a quick aside, without the use of wedging and tops, I could not have been able to achieve this. I used wedging to wedge all the different layers of webs, saving it, but also using wedging in order to sim what you just saw in the slide before. So really, I don't think you need the most amazing knowledge of tops in order to use tops in your workflow. I literally just use these 2 nodes to bake out all my geometry. And here's just some additional details that I wanted to add. I don't think warrants like a whole slide in itself, but I created some polygons just to cover up some of the holes to give it slightly bit more depth. I added some static webs that won't be simmed, and some of that goopy material also statically just laid inside the wall. And this last one over here on the right is some intersection geometry where that fleshy stuff attaches to the character. And finally, we're at the simulation stage, now that we have all of our webs. And my initial attempt was, I had this grand plan to sim it all at the same time. I want to sim everything and do everything in DOPS, but it ended up not happening like that. And because it was too complex, working with grains, something that's not strings, is way too unpredictable. It was just really hard to art direct. And but what did work for me though was these two concepts right here. That was really the main driving force behind what got my webs to look the way they did. The one was using welds. So in Vellum, if you have points on top of each other, you can weld them together and set a breaking threshold. So let's say when the breaking threshold or the line stretch above 1, the weld would break and the strings would snap. So that's the one you see on the left there. And how that applies to my webs is, this is one of my deep layers of webs in the middle, where those green points are where I cut the curves and welded the points together. So those points are the only points on the webs that are allowed to break. And the last one is just dynamic attachment, where when the welds break, they attach to our creature and sort of glide down his body. And that was really the secondary part of the sim. The main one was really just controlling the welding and where I cut these webs. And this is the final, this is one layer from each of the layers of webs, if you can follow that. Layer 1 and 2 are the deep webs, and layer 3 is the surface web. And some collisions were giving me issues, so I just deleted it. Yeah, so whatever works, right? So you'll see that the webs nicely slide down the character as they break apart. And let's talk about how I set up the simulation for that. So here, I'll show the simulation I did on the surface webs. So again, I only work with one layer of webs at a time to keep things simple. And here I wanted to droop the webs to get an initial state for the webs, I guess. And this is so that, well, webs in real life react to gravity, but so far I haven't used gravity to sim anything. So this is just to get that initial look. So after setting up some attributes, attaching it to the wall, the webs sort of just sag and go slack. And I do that again with every layer. And that is the initial state of one of my webs. And coming here is, I would say, one of the most important parts, where I create geometry to cut the webs. So here I create some geometry and I use polycut and unique points in order to cut the webs where that geometry intersects the webs. So here I color coded them green. These are the webs that are unique. So these webs are these points are on top of each other. And again, if I display the geometry, you'll see that it intersects. And this is where I weld and create the break threshold. So those little dots represent the welds that are on the webs. And yeah, and we run the character through it and it just all works, which is what we all hope. So there are actually a lot of things that Vellum allows you to control, even though I was really only focusing on where to cut the webs and playing with the break threshold of the welds. Here, what got me the most success is keyframing pretty much the break threshold of the weld. So what happens is, in Vellum, you can use a geometry wrangle to decrease the strength of the break threshold. So I would set the break threshold to say 100, meaning the welds will never break. And then if I lower it down to 0, the welds will break. So once I set those keyframes, I can control exactly where the welds would break. And that in conjunction with using collision groups. So if you look at the creature, there are different colors of the body. Those are the different collision groups. So there was a part of the sim where when the creature lifts his hand up from the wall, a lot of the geometry is actually inside of the hand. And without these collision groups, when he raises his hand up, all the webs would just come flying everywhere. But setting a certain frame to ignore that hand collision allowed me to make sure that the webs do not stick on the hands. So keyframing, basically these two things, allowed me to art direct exactly when I want the webs to break and where. And lastly, I just painted the character to determine how fast the webs will slide on the character. So here, let's take another look. The paint scale is illustrated by the color. So red is where the webs will slide the most. And then when it reaches to the purple areas, the webs will stop sliding altogether. So if you look closely, once the webs reach the purple area, they'll stop sliding. And on layer 3 over here, the head is purple because I don't want the webs to slide off of the head. And there I specifically keyframed the exact moment I want the welds to break there. So that gave me a lot of control that I needed. And the next part of the simulation is the goop. This is what I call the fleshy bits that attach to the character. And the challenge with this one was sort of getting where I want these the Y intersections to take place. So take a look here. So in the concept, the character attaches, there's a lot of these fleshy bits attached to the character in specific locations. So here I created a target primitive attribute and just typed the primitive number that I want that string to attach to. So what I literally did was I zoomed in, displayed the primitive number, and chose that primitive to be attached to the fleshy bit. And here I merged all of them together. They look like this. And I wanted, of course, the ends of these fleshy bits to attach to the wall. So I used a ray to do that. And this next part, the attribute promote, was just done to attach the other end of these strings to the character. So if I display the geometry, it'll make a little bit more sense. And here I edit the positions of these strings just a little bit. So it'll behave a bit better with this when we run the simulation. And here is an important part where I make sure that the strings are attached to the character in the correct spot. And you'll see that our creature is a little bit wonky. That's because when the creature is in its rest position, a lot of these strings are attached and it just penetrates the geometry, and simulations don't like intercolliding geometry. So the easiest way that I found to do that was just to rotate that part of the geometry 180 degrees so that when the sim starts, it doesn't collide. So it'll make a lot more sense when you see this. This is the start of the simulation. So yeah, you attach the geometry when it doesn't collide. So when it rotates, it wraps nicely around like it should be. So that is a quick fix. And this next part here is to control where exactly these strings split off. So again, we look at the reference. There's a specific location where these fleshy bits connect at that Y junction. So, but first, when we make these strings, we decrease the rest length to 0.3 to make sure that they pull tight when the simulation begins. But coming here, I use stitch constraints to stitch the strings to one another. And those yellow lines are where the stitch constraints are. And when we come up here, I use the group by range to target the specific group of points that I want to create the string constraints on. So when I move this length here, you'll see that I can control exactly where I want these lines to split, which is really nice. And basically, I just group these strings 2 by 2 so that they'll know who to stitch to. And there's that. And that's basically the bulk of the setup for these fleshy bits. So yeah, there you can see again, the collision geometry has to rotate before this guy comes out. And you'll see that there's a really big sphere connected to his shoulder. That's because that string keeps getting caught on the shoulder, but it's okay. Nobody will ever know. So, okay. And here's just some additional sims that I did that just to add on to the effect a little bit. The first part is just instancing points and some RBD debris chunks onto fast moving parts of the web. So when the webs reach a certain velocity threshold, these little rocks will just fall down. And then obviously, these rocks emit some pyro. So just emitting some smoke from the trails of those little rocks there. And then the webs itself, the faster they move, the denser the volume that comes off of these webs. So these are just some of the extra things that I added to the simulation. And the last part of this is the rendering. And this is just a quick 2 slides to talk about the rendering. I rendered using Karma, built this scene within Solaris. And this helped me be able to iterate, really visualize which geometry is coming in. I can disconnect geometry if I wanted to look dev a specific part. So it was very useful for that. But when I was rendering, I was able to use Karma XPU, which thankfully I was using Houdini 19.5. So Karma XPU is in beta. And it ended up working really well for the main beauty render. But I still had to use CPU for stuff like the environment fog, utility passes like the depth and the cryptomat, and just some additional stuff. And this is the last slide where I just showcased quickly Material X is working really well with Karma XPU. It can read in attributes. So I created an ambient occlusion map there on the left, and Material X reads that imperfectly. So I use that as a mask to change the albedo and the roughness and stuff like that. And again, just special thanks to Tristan and Gabe for helping me do the character. And thanks to Michael, Serkan, Dan, and John for guidance throughout this project. Thank you very much.